usually not.
Now for Raising the Bar, Greater RVA's premier Law Talk radio show. Call into the show with your stories and questions at 804-454-1366. 804-454-1366.
Good morning and welcome to Raising the Bar, Greater RVA's Law Talk radio show. This is Colleen Quinn of Locke Quinn, your host of today's show. Raising the Bar Legal Talk radio show brings an exciting and varied array of legal topics to listeners throughout Central Virginia and especially in the greater Richmond area. At least once per week at 9 a.m. on Wednesdays, the one-hour show features true life stories and cases, legal tips, and information from experts and specialists. The law touches nearly every aspect of daily life, and this show brings both humorous and entertaining stories, along with some more sobering stories and helpful tips, including tips on access to legal services, something that not everyone can afford. Last week, we did access to justice, focusing on pro bono services and getting legal services and good legal advice. You can view any of the Law Talk radio shows on the Locke & Quinn Facebook page. We also next week will be featuring divorce, support, and custody issues featuring my law partner, Richard Locke, and our senior associate, Shannon Otto. So tune in for next week's show at 9 a.m. But now let's turn to this week's show. This week we're going to be focusing on understanding head injuries, their intersection with the law. Head injuries occur in all different types of sports. And of course, now we're learning so much more with regard to how they affect domestic violence or how they might actually cause some domestic violence situations. Today's going to be a really interesting show. And with me is Anne McDonell, who's the Executive Director of the Brain Injury Association of Virginia. Good morning, Anne.
Good morning, Colleen. It's McDonell.
McDonell. Yes, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I said McDowell. You know, that's it's the Irish in me. It's any Mick, just but so at any rate, if you want to call into the show today, remember to call 804-454-1366. So, Anne, let's talk a little bit about what is the Brain Injury Association of Virginia?
The Brain Injury Association of Virginia is a statewide nonprofit focused on advocating and serving individuals who've been impacted by brain injury. We've been around for nearly 35 years. Next January will be our 35th anniversary of the day we started. We started because parents were having kids survive terrible brain injuries, and we had no system of care. We were just beginning to learn how to keep these people alive. And so BIAV was formed to answer questions and provide support to folks who were trying to figure this road out. And 35 years later, we know a great deal more. We provide information and referral. We do quite a bit of education. We advocate for public policy change, and we try to raise public awareness.
Great. So, Anne, tell us a little bit about what is your background and how did you get into this area?
Well, I'm an occupational therapist by training. I worked at Sheltering Arms Rehabilitation Hospital for 15 years working in brain injury rehabilitation. I discovered it on my physical disabilities clinical fieldwork at the VA hospital. So my very first exposure was brain injury in veterans. And that was when I realized that this was probably where I needed to focus my career because it just intrigued me so. And so I worked in rehabilitation for years as an occupational therapist. My primary job in the hospital was teaching individuals how to feed themselves, dress themselves, bathe, that sort of thing. When we got into community-based settings, I got to do lots of fun stuff. I got to help them relearn how to cook and keep a house and manage their checkbook and drive a car and the things that create a life. And so it was very, very meaningful work. And about 15 years ago, I came to the Brain Injury Association of Virginia, pretty much so I could just advocate on a larger scale for folks who have some really significant needs.
Wow, that's a really compelling area in which to work. So many folks are familiar with head injuries that happen from sports, in particular, there's so much emphasis on football, which we'll talk about. But what are some of the many different ways in which head injuries or brain injuries can occur not in the sports world?
Well, interestingly enough, over the last few years, we've seen the number one cause of brain injury go from car accidents to falls. As the population ages, we see falls happening at a greater rate. I think, too, there are, lots of recreational pursuits in which falls could happen. Car accidents are certainly a way that individuals sustain brain injuries. Folks can have strokes. Folks can have arterial venous malformations or blood vessels in their brain that are malformed and suddenly give way. Folks can have a lack of oxygen because of a heart attack or a drowning or an electrocution. Folks can have an infection of the brain, and certainly individuals can have brain tumors. So we see lots and lots of different ways that the brain can be impacted.
So this is something that even though if you're really, really careful, you don't fall down, you're not in a motor vehicle accident, you're not engaged in any sports that might cause injury, a head injury or brain injury is really something that could happen to anybody, just given your luck or your unluckiness.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've said in the past is we're all sort of one banana peel away. Accidents happen every day, even to people who are incredibly cautious. And even if it's not something accident related, it could be something that's been brewing in your brain for a very long time. I think the fact that we're all susceptible is one of the things that causes us to have difficulty about recognizing the frequency of brain injury and how at risk we all are.
So what is the definition of a head injury or brain injury, or we also hear traumatic brain injury? Can you kind of give us some idea of what that mean, what those terms mean?
Yeah, well, you can have a head injury without having a brain injury. Scalp wounds bleed like crazy, but, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've had a brain injury if you cut your head against the corner of a cabinet, for example, like I did when I was 4. Brain injuries, though, involve some sort of issue with the organ itself. So there are brain injuries that certainly can happen in utero, individuals who may abuse substances or chromosomal abnormalities or any number of things can happen to a child while the brain is still in utero. What we talk about with the Brain Injury Association are those individuals that have had a period of normal development outside the womb, and then something happens. So they've been born, everything's okay, and then something happens. Brain injuries primarily happen in one of two ways. We sort of distinguish them as traumatic and non-traumatic. Traumatic would be those things that are involved in a car accident, a fall, an assault, that sort of thing, a blow or some sort of external force. The non-traumatic injuries are those things that can happen as a result of stroke or infection or, diabetic coma. I had a couple of patients that had brain injuries as a result of that. Heart attack, those things that sort of happen because of something that's going on internally in the body. And that's sort of how we make a distinction when we need to. If you ask me, pretty much all brain injuries are traumatic. I don't know why we have to say traumatic and non-traumatic, but
I think traumatic as in terms of the trauma, the external impact, versus traumatic as in terms of anybody or any family that is assisting someone that's a head injury is going to find it to be a very traumatic experience. Certainly. So we have a lot of different usages of that word, traumatic. And then I'm also familiar with there's different distinctions at times between mild and severe. So can you talk a little bit about the spectrum of brain injury?
When an individual sustains a brain injury and EMS is activated, for example, or they go to the hospital, they may be rated on something called the Glasgow Coma Scale, or GCS for short. And that's generally the tool that we use to sort of rate brain injuries. It's a 15-point scale, and you get a 3 for showing up alive in the ER. So 3 to 7 is considered to be a very severe injury. Those individuals are having trouble following commands. They may only moan to a painful stimulus. Their eyes probably aren't open. A moderate injury is from 8 to 12. Those individuals may be able to follow command. They may be fuzzy. They may have had a brief loss of consciousness. Mild injuries are 13 to 15. Those individuals generally don't lose consciousness, are able to follow commands, but certainly are experiencing the effects of a concussion.
And attorneys like myself that do personal injury cases, we're very familiar with the Glasgow Coma score because, of course, that's used by all the ambulance and rescue workers. It's a scale that's used by everybody. But what's interesting is that even with a mild traumatic brain injury, like from an auto accident, a person could still have a lot of long-term repercussions or symptoms. So let's talk a little bit about what are some of the symptoms of a brain injury, because there is also a pretty broad spectrum of symptoms that occur, at least from the cases I've seen and handled, and I know you working in this field have seen even more.
Well, individuals who sustained a severe injury may have difficulty moving around. One side of the body could be impaired, paralyzed, just slow to move, very, very tight. They generally have trouble with their balance, so walking may be difficult. They may need to sit in a wheelchair. They have trouble thinking. They may have trouble eating, swallowing foods, those sort of things. As you move through the spectrum, things begin to change. And at the very mild end of the spectrum, I think that's where we have the most misunderstanding about brain injury and the effect of multiple concussions. So when someone sustains a concussion, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to lose consciousness. So we need to understand that folks can look perfectly normal. I've talked to a number of folks. There was a football player I talked to a couple of years ago. He said after he got hit and he opened his eyes that the sky was orange. So, you know, you may have some visual sort of symptoms. You may have a headache. You may have some balance problems, some intermittent dizziness. A woman that I know couldn't turn her head for 6 months without setting off a wave of dizziness. So you've hit your head, or you've, jarred it enough that something's just not right. You're not thinking as clearly or as quickly. You feel like you're sort of wading through molasses. Those may be indications that perhaps a further workup is needed.
You mentioned the balance issues, and I've handled a number of cases where folks have had a brain injury and then they have those balance issues and they're literally, holding their hand against the wall, or they're using a cane. And the problem is that sometimes with those balance issues, then they will have falls, which will then further compound the brain injury, which some folks don't realize that the falls then are actually a result of having incurred the brain injury in the first place. So what does a person actually have to hit their head to have a brain injury?
No, several years ago there was a study to look at whether or not roller coasters might cause brain injury, and there really wasn't any conclusive evidence there. But, when someone is in a car accident, their head may just be bobbled severely enough and never hit anything to create damage to the inside of the brain. The brain sits inside the skull in this little sort of bath of fluid, and that's really all the protection that it has. And so because that substance is fluid, it moves around. So the brain can move around slightly inside the skull without ever hitting anything and sustain damage.
Yeah, and then working with Dr. Greg Oshanek, who you know well, he actually has one of those brain models that shows the gray jelly mass of the brain, and then describes in a whiplash injury the coup contra coup experience, where that jelly mass basically goes forward and hits the front part of the skull, and then that jelly mass of our brain goes backward and hits the back part of the skull, and basically is shearing axons in the brain in that process. So in that whiplash injury, the person doesn't necessarily have to even hit their head on, the back of their seat or anything. It's just that forward back coup contra coup motion that you're actually having your brain impact with a hard object, that is the front of the skull, and then a hard object, the back of the skull. And having an actual model to look at and watch it, and watch that kind of gelatin mass of our brain is one of the best things I've seen in terms of trying to explain to folks what's going on when somebody has a head injury, especially one that doesn't actually have an impact involved.
It never ceases to amaze me. I mean, the brain truly is about the consistency of congealed oatmeal. You could, pardon me, put your finger through it with no effort at all. I've held one in my hands. And to think that this thing has created everything that we're sort of, and what we know and how we communicate to each other. It's quite fascinating. How is it that the brain works? I've heard it said that you bring the brain you have to the accident. Well, perhaps that's true. I think individuals who have higher education are more likely to have a stronger recovery. However, a woman that I know who's a terrific advocate for individuals with brain injuries, she was an economist, a PhD, Duke-trained economist working at the World Bank in D.C., and she was rear-ended in a minor car accident. She sustained a mild traumatic brain injury and has never been able to go back to that job.
Wow. I've seen, especially in older women, that multitask, and sometimes there are higher functioning, that they actually have a little bit more difficulty because of the multitasking. It's almost as if you have a dresser drawer, and women in particular tend to have 10 drawers open at once, and no offense to men, but they sometimes have a more linear mindset, and they only have 1 or 2 drawers open. And so when you have that head injury and you now have this sense of disorganization, and also some memory issues, you're suddenly having the 10 drawers open. It just doesn't work anymore,
Well, true. And there's been some really interesting studies over the years. I haven't kept up on them lately about, the effect of estrogen, what difference the actual hormones that we have and how that impacts our own response to injury, brain injury and recovery.
And we haven't talked about emotional lability, but
right.
But that's a huge aspect of brain injuries, is the emotional component that people do with a brain injury do become a little bit more emotional. The mood swings, the irrationality becomes more enhanced.
I was doing a presentation, this was years ago, it was our first outreach campaign to persons that work in domestic violence shelters. And we recognize that there are a lot of people out there who are the victims of domestic violence who are sustaining multiple repeated concussions, and it's impacting their daily life. And my very first presentation, I could see light bulbs going off in the audience. If you're wondering why your folks can't seem to get it together, are missing appointments, make bad decisions, go back to the, individual that beat them, cry a lot, maybe it's because they have a brain injury. And so this campaign has taken off. I testified a couple of weeks ago at a domestic violence briefing on Capitol Hill.
Wow.
States are doing domestic violence outreach. And, you have to wonder, with recent news about the link of domestic violence in the past of many of these individuals who've committed mass shootings, maybe there's something there. Wayne Gordon, who's a researcher at Mount Sinai, said years ago that he thought brain injury was the hidden cause of social failure. And the rate of brain injury is higher in the homeless. It's higher in the justice involved. It's higher among individuals who commit violent acts. You just sort of have to wonder.
That's an interesting point, Anne, because we don't think about the person that has been battered as part of the domestic violence incurring those head injuries. But in most batterings, there is a head injury or multiple head injuries that are implicated. I had one young lady who her boyfriend came home, and he was had abused substances, and he just repeatedly took her head and pounded it into the floor, which then when you're trying to work with that type of client, it compounds things because they have memory issues, and in terms of even making appointments, as you mentioned, it becomes harder to help somebody that has endured that sort of trauma. Or
talking to the police, when they can't remember things very well and their story sort of begins to change, they become an unreliable witness. I think one of our desires at BIAV is to do an outreach campaign to first responders about brain injury and what it looks like and why you might get different stories, and just sort of understanding how to respond to individuals.
Well, it's really a hidden injury because unless, as you mentioned before, there's bleeding on the brain or bleeding on the head. If there's bleeding on the brain, we can't see it, but on the head, it's inside the person.
Right.
And so it's very hard for folks to kind of understand what might be going on in that individual because you can't really see an immediate injury.
I run BIAV runs a camp program that I've been involved with for 30 years. And we'll be sitting down late at night in front of the campfire, and individuals who are ambulatory, who may have driven themselves to camp, who might be able to work part-time, have said to me sometimes they wish they were in a wheelchair because then people would be more understanding. And I mean, that's to say you wish you were in a wheelchair. What must that life be like?
Yeah. And the interesting thing too, I've observed about brain injuries is that a lot of folks that have brain injuries also are cognizant of the fact that they have the brain injury, which makes it very frustrating for them. I had one lady who actually she was a medical record coder, so she had memorized 2 huge, large volumes of medical coding, and after her auto accident, she could no longer remember any of the codes, and we see a lot of that, and inability to work with numbers and transposing numbers, and just not being able to do your checkbook anymore. Right. But she was so cognizant of her brain injury, and she said it was so frustrating because she would try to take care of her grandbaby, and she would take the grandbaby's food and put it in the microwave, and then she would overheat it, and then she would put it in the freezer to cool it down, and then she would forget about it, and then the grandbaby would say, "Grandma, what about my food?" And then she would forget where she had put it, and then she also said that she would go to the laundry, and she would forget whether she ran the laundry or she didn't run the laundry, and it was like semi-wet, but she wasn't sure, and so she said it was so frustrating because she was aware all the time of these little things that kept reminding her of her level of forgetfulness, and she could no longer do her job, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that there are some things that are sort of amenable to compensatory strategies. That's one of the things that OTs love to do. We do these lists of exactly how you perform certain tasks, and so people will decide at some point, okay, I recognize I can't do this. I'm going to use this list. I hate it, but it will make it easier.
Right.
Versus some folks who just say no, and they continue to struggle. Everybody's got a right to choose their own path, but there are some things, particularly when you have a job that requires you to memorize 2 huge books of codes, there's no compensatory strategy that can fix that.
Right, right. And as an occupational therapist, I mean, you're well aware of some of the compensatory strategies that are being taught to people, and one of which is just to kind of simplify your life, try to streamline things as well. So one of the aspects that I'd like to pursue a little bit further after we take our break is the impulsivity of folks that have brain injuries, because that inability to regulate, and actually it was interesting as I started to find in some of my cases, the sexual impulsivity. Oh. And I think you have a really interesting story to tell about one of your camps that I'd love to share after the break. If you have any questions, please call in 804-454-1366. I'm talking to Anne McDonell, and I'm going to get that last name right, of the Brain Injury Association of Virginia. Please join Anne and me after the break. Thanks.
You've been listening to Raising the Bar, Greater Richmond's premier law talk radio show. Call into the show with your stories and questions at 804-454-1366. 804-454-1366.
With SRN News, I'm Rich Thomason in Washington. There's some encouraging news for retailers ahead of the holiday shopping season. The government says that retail sales rose at a solid pace last month, up 0.2%. The storm swirling about Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore shows no signs of easing. Moore says the sexual misconduct allegations against him are false. He says he will not quit the campaign. Police in Northern California say the gunman behind yesterday's shooting rampage had feuded with a couple of his neighbors before he opened fire in multiple locations, killing 4 people. Police and federal agents searching a working-class Tampa, Florida neighborhood, hunting for a killer after the latest shooting there, the 4th in a little more than a month. On Wall Street, Dow futures down 121. More details at srnnews.com.
Interested in trading as a way to generate extra monthly income? Listen up. Before you sign up for some garbage program or awkward in-person seminar, you really need to hear about the online trader program that everyone's talking about. This is the program that allows you to get your account funded with someone else's money. That's right. Apiary Fund will gladly put up to $100,000 of their money into your trading account. And the best part, you get to keep 85% of the profits without putting in a dime of your own money. Apiary Fund and this program are growing like crazy. If you're looking for a way to generate extra income every month and finally learn how to win trades like the pros, just call 800-342-2968. Leave your email address on our voicemail and we will send you all the exciting details of how to trade Apiary Fund's money and not your own. Call 800-342-2968. And again, just leave your email on our voicemail to get your free report on how you can trade someone else's money. Call 800-342-2968. That's 800-342-2968.
Driving back from the shore? Just putting the utensils away from that late summer cookout. Hi, this is Pat Rogers, inviting you to join me on Sunday evenings at 7 p.m. for the Love Doctor Radio Hour. 60 minutes of unqualified opinion, unparalleled nonsense, and your calls. I look forward to sharing a laugh with you on Sundays at 7 p.m. right here on AM 820 and Almost 98, 97.7 FM, WNTW.
He was after real Republicans, shown-up Republicans, onion-toting Republicans. He was not after the blueberry-toting Republican. He's got him already. He's already weak. He doesn't need to shoot him. But if a Republican is going to tote a set of onions, that's the one he wants to take out.
Tune in to Brother Craig the Hatchet Man, Saturdays 10 a.m. to noon, rebroadcast Sundays 9 to 11 a.m. here on Richmond's Choice for Conservative Talk Radio, WNTW 820 a.m. and 97.7 FM, The Answer.
Now, back to Raising the Bar. Call into the show with your stories and questions at 804-454-1366. 804-454-1366.
We are back. Welcome back to Raising the Bar, the Law Talk Radio Show. Today we're talking about understanding brain injury, and with me is Anne McDonell, without the D on the end like McDonald's. And she's got a very, very green Irish shirt here as well. So we're with Colleen Quinn and Anne McDonell.
That's
quite
right.
The Irish team this morning. So we're talking about brain injuries, and we were talking about some of the symptoms and then some of the more unusual symptoms, one of which is impulsivity. And of course, with any sort of impulsivity and also inability to have boundaries, one of the areas that folks don't always know about is sexual impulsivity. Mm-hmm. And I know that you've encountered that, especially in your camp program with the Brain Injury Association of Virginia. So if you could share maybe a story or two about some of the sexual impulsivity areas you've seen.
Well, the frontal lobe, which sits right above the eyes, is the last lobe to develop in the brain. It's sort of the last one to wire in. And the frontal lobe is that part of our brain that helps us make good decisions, helps us control impulses. And so, our brains don't normally wire in a perfectly functioning brain until we're about 25. And if you sort of doubt me, I challenge you to go back and think about some of the stellar decisions that you made when you were 20 and how sex led some of those stellar decisions, because, we're learning how to work in the world, how to walk in the world. But the frontal lobe is really susceptible to injury. So anger control can be difficult. It's a part of impulsivity. Just checking your actions, knowing when not to say something, knowing when not to act a certain way. So in individuals who've been injured at a fairly young age, as teenage boys or young 20-year-old boys, they're automatically in that phase of life. They may be finding it difficult to find a girlfriend, and they've had damage to the frontal lobe, the part of the brain that tells them to act like a gentleman and not do something stupid. Well, So, yeah, we've had a number of instances at camp where folks have come thinking that, this might be the place that they get lucky. It's a 2-week program. We do 1 week, 2 1-week sessions, and then it's residential. So, we have campers there overnight for 6 days. We have a lot of staff, and we have the campers and the staff understand that we have a couple of basic rules. Even if you are of age and you do not have a legal guardian, that's just not something that happens at camp. Number 1 rule is we don't touch anything that's not normally covered by a bathing suit. And number 2 is we don't leave camp with any more campers than we showed up with.
Oh, there you go.
I try to keep the rules pretty simple. So yeah, we had one young man show up with enough condoms for the entire camp to have sex practically 24 hours a day.
Holy cow.
It was really incredible. And he was absolutely looking for opportunities to use them, but we were on top of things. We did have a young girl come one time, and she was really, she had, I think, as part of her injury, an extreme case of sexual promiscuity. So she required 24-hour one-to-one, because we did at one point turn our back, and we ended up finding her in the walk-in freezer with some young man in full embrace, not touching anything that wasn't covered by a bathing suit, but literally happened like that. So yeah, we have to keep our eyes on it, and we need to, remind these young men that if this didn't work for you before, it's probably not going to work for you now.
Right. So I'm going to dub you Anne McDonell, sex police woman. You've got several different roles as an executive director. So we've got a call from Katie. Katie, you're on the air?
Hi, yes. So I've been listening to sort of what you guys have been saying this morning, and it seems like a lot of the ways that brain injury manifests can be really subtle, just personality changes. So, I mean, how do you know if you might need treatment for something like this? It seems like you could be walking through life with a brain injury and not even know it, or your spouse could, or someone you know or love. So what sort of things do you need to be on the lookout for?
That's an excellent question, Katie, and it's actually one I wanted to make sure we hit upon today. So that's a wonderful question. Because actually we have a number of first responders who oftentimes don't recognize that somebody has a head injury. And I know that Anne had mentioned earlier training first responders in particular. So let's talk a little bit about that, how head injuries are missed and not detected, and the frequency with which that happens, and how maybe that can be done a little bit better.
Well, I think that, raising awareness of the issue, and perhaps looking at some of the concussion protocols that are being used by sports teams, having first responders use a similar kind of protocol to find out if they think someone has sustained a concussion. I think part of what Katie was trying to get at was, how do you know if there's been a personality change? Mild brain injuries are missed all the time. I think there are a lot of people, to borrow your words, Katie, that are walking around with it that don't know. Years ago, when we first entered Iraq and we were talking about brain injury being the signature wound of the war, my husband made the comment to me that a lot of guys who go into the military probably already have brain injuries because they played football.
Wow.
So I do think a lot of people are walking around. I think that if you are an individual that, has figured out a way to sort of manage your symptoms, then there's probably nothing more that you need. If you find that, you've had a fall or a car accident, or, hit your head hard, and you notice something different, then what you probably should do is mention it first to your primary care physician and ask them, what their level of familiarity treating concussion is, or post-concussive syndrome. There are some folks that need to get diagnosed years later, and at that point what we generally do is refer them to an individual profession called neuropsychology. These folks are trained to administer very specific tests and can look back and see, how's your problem solving stack up against people of a similar age and similar education? How does your impulse control? and they may be able to track back someone. But if you can think back to a time when you definitely had your bell rung, or you had a brain infection or a brain tumor, and you think that there may be something there, you could certainly have that looked into as well.
Yeah, on that same score, Katie, thank you so much for that question. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for calling in. Remember, you can call into the show with any questions at 804-454-1366. And in talking about trying to diagnose head injuries or folks that are walking around not even knowing they have them, I had a client come in recently who we knew she had a head injury, but the extent of it really wasn't apparent until she finally got to a really good professional. And just her finding out and having the confirmation that she wasn't going crazy, she wasn't going insane, was very healthy for her. But she also was actually diagnosed also with PTSD as a component of the head injury, because she had been struggling with it, and also just basically she was still reliving the accident and then how it had impacted her. So a lot of times too, we don't always, not only is the head injury or the brain injury not detected, but there might be some other compounding emotional, mental health issues going on as well. When we talk about football, there's been so much information in the press about how football can cause head injuries. We've got the no targeting rule in college football now. We've got the Richmond Times-Dispatch running a series on, brain injuries and how we can prevent those. We've got Aaron Hernandez, the football player for the New England Patriots, who was convicted of murder and then recently committed suicide. And then when they basically did the brain scans, they showed the chronic traumatic encephalopathy, if I get that word, CTE for short. But we don't really talk about how brain injuries can happen in other sports besides football. So in your experience, Anne, in what other sports do you commonly or have you seen brain injuries occur?
I think pretty commonly in soccer. It's not so much from the heading of the ball, it's from those on-field collisions when people run into each other and then they fall down. So I've been aware, particularly as soccer has become a sport that's taken over the country and youth leagues and travel leagues, and it's become a very competitive sport. And I've seen it equally in guys and girls. I do think young women have a little longer recovery period. It's just sort of been my experience. I don't know that I can prove that, but just anecdotally, that's what my gut is telling me. We've seen individuals sustain brain injuries in volleyball because a fall is very common there, particularly when sweaty people land on the floor and the floor is wet. Cheerleading, interestingly enough, is a frequent cause of brain injury. They're doing lots more tricks, and people fall and land and hit their head. We actually had a spokesman years ago for the Brain Injury Association of America who was a former cheerleader. So just about any sport, baseball, sometimes they wear batting helmets. The thing about helmets, so the batting helmets, you're most likely to be hit by a pitch when you're standing at the plate. And so those helmets are good for that sort of thing. It's a protective sort of shell. But helmets in football, I think, give this impression of greater safety than they provide, because the jarring effect of those tackles does not stop the brain from sloshing around in the skull.
Right.
So, a helmet might protect you from something hitting your head, but not necessarily your head hitting something.
That gray oatmeal mass that we talked about before is still impacting inside the skull.
You reminded me, Colleen, you might have to scroll down and maybe we'll repost it, but on our Facebook page, we have a GIF or a GIF or whatever that shows that sort of jelly-like mass that you were talking about Dr. Oceanic having. So, we'll repost it so it's up top at the page, but you should take a look at that because ew.
Yeah, it's amazing how squishy the brain really is. So going back to some of the cases where we're seeing a correlation between somebody with a head injury and then causing the domestic violence. We talked about the person that had been battered and had the head injuries, but going back to that, in the Aaron Hernandez case, the football player for the New England Patriots, is actually an interesting case. It's somewhat controversial because there's an issue of whether he had some violent tendencies before he had the brain disease. But then there's a question of some people just might, if they do have violent or aggressive tendencies, might be more susceptible to then engaging in domestic violence if they have the brain disease. So I just kind of wanted to have you comment on your observations in this whole new awareness that we're seeing on folks that are the batterers that have issues or had previous issues with head injuries.
I think in some of these cases, it sort of feels like the dog chasing the tail, which came first sort of thing. So I'm not sure. I think that individuals who have impulse control issues have anger management issues. They sort of go hand in hand. And there could be any number of reasons for an impulse control problem. It could be that there was something wrong with the basic wiring that created that. It could be that there was some sort of prenatal abuse. It could be that as a kid, he rough and tumbled a lot and he fell, and he rode a skateboard and he fell a couple of times. And the effect of multiple jars to the brain created an area or susceptibility to further problems with impulse control and anger management. So I think that, I'm not exactly sure where it started for Aaron Hernandez, but I know that it started long before he started playing football. And there was probably something at the cellular level, And
then it could not have helped to have taken hit after hit in football.
Mm-hmm.
And we focus so much on the football, but as you mentioned, there's so many other sports,
mm-hmm.
And in particular, there hasn't been much focus on soccer, which is really taking over because almost any kid can go out and kick a ball.
I think it's become the go-to sport for folks that are pulling their kids out of football.
Right.
It's very similar. Rugby's also a sport. I think that, the parents aren't, but individuals are looking at as sort of an alternative to football because they don't tackle.
Right.
In the same way. Yes, they don't wear helmets, but they also don't tackle. Yeah, you could fall and still hit your head on the ground, but no one's using their head as a spear because of that, supposed invincibility of the helmet.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the intersection of brain injuries and the law. Of course, for criminal attorneys, understanding the head injury and having that as a possible defense for their clients. But for those of us that are in the area of personal injury, why is it important for lawyers that are handling brain injury cases to really understand the issues?
Well, we know of a lot of individuals who sustained their brain injury when they were 20 and 30, who went home and lived with mom and dad because they're not able to live on their own. And their parents are aging. And so what's going to happen to these individuals when their parents are no longer able to care for them? So the long-term and the lifelong consequences, not every case where an individual sustains a brain injury is one that's appropriate for legal intervention. But for those that are, taking the really long view about the types of supports and services that an individual needs. In the state of Virginia right now, there are so few options for long-term living for someone with a brain injury that even if you guys were successful in getting larger settlements for these folks, you might very well end up having to ship them out of state to receive that care. So that's one thing we could use your help for. Help us get better settlements for these folks and help us create a system that serves them better over the length of their life.
And that's so important. In many of these cases, we employ a life care planner.
Yeah, love them.
Right, and really try to show just how expensive the care is going to be down the road. But what's even more unfortunate are the brain injury cases which were not caused by an accident where you can get a recovery. And those have large implications for estate planning,
mm-hmm.
And making sure that somebody has a guardianship or a conservatorship set up, and
mm-hmm.
that the parents who are taking care of that individual have adequate estate planning in place. The other thing that I've realized in working with folks with brain injuries is you really have to understand the brain injury in order to work with the client, including, doing those constant reminders, almost like the doctor's office, texting and emailing and calling in the morning. By the way, your appointment is this afternoon. I mean, one of my paralegals is very astute and very good at kind of knowing with our brain injured clients that we're going to need to do a lot more hand-holding with the client. Also, when Katie called in and asked about the injuries that kind of go undetected, what I've noticed is that it's oftentimes the spouse or the person that's really close to the person that actually is sometimes the one that picks up on the head injury, because people will say, this is not the woman I married, or this is not the man that I married. This is a different person. Interestingly enough, years ago, one of the employees of the Brain Injury Association of Virginia was involved in an accident on 295 right outside of Mechanicsville. Her car was hit by a tractor trailer. She was taken to MCV, which is a level 1 trauma hospital, and she was treated for the vertebral fractures that she had. But even they missed the brain injury. So employee of the Brain Injury Association of Virginia sustains a mild injury where she has vertebral fractures. They're missed at MCV. She's discharged home, and about 10 days later, when she really was messing up her medications, her husband was the one who said, I'm not sure we're still dealing with a neck here. Right. And this was somebody who worked for BIAV. So that sort of speaks a little bit to, how difficult it can be to thread out some of these things, particularly in an acute phase when somebody's hurting and fuzzy and. Right. Because oftentimes you have the neck pain and you have the back pain and you have the other pains going on. I've had folks in my office, and thank goodness I've had the spouse or the partner sit in, because I'll start asking questions, and I'm not a doctor, but I know enough about brain injury to ask, are you experiencing this? Are you experiencing that? And they'll sit there and go, oh, I'm not really sure. But the spouse will be like, yes, she or he has that. And all of those different things, basically is been more confused and has been crying all the time, et cetera. And so we also have those folks that don't seem to want to acknowledge either that they're experiencing some of those symptoms, which can be scary. In terms of trying these cases, again, it goes back to the wheelchair. You almost wish the client was in a wheelchair, because a jury can't see, they can't see the injury. And so, so many times in these cases, one, it's good to have good exhibits, like Dr. Oshanik's brain, that shows it. But two, we pretty much end up trying the case through the spouse or the partner and the person at work that's noticed, or the boss or the supervisor, because they're really the ones that can attest to the symptoms. I found it fascinating in the case that I was talking about earlier about the BIAV employee. I was called in during the settlement process and was told that I was, in fact, a devastating witness for. Well, you're quite, you're quite the observer. So well, and it was really weird, because I think that was the first time, honestly, that I had the opportunity to know someone well before their injury and know them well after, because most of the time I come in contact with people after their injury. Right. So you don't have a baseline. I don't. And so in very few cases where I've had the opportunity to know someone before and know them after, and I know I'm looking for it, because that's what I'm trained to do, and I can spot very subtle changes. It used to drive my mother crazy. When I would see changes in her cognitive level, it was a result of her heart attack, But there's a difference, and you can see it, in individuals, and maybe not all cases at not all times, but in these two cases I'm thinking of, there was a very obvious difference, and no one would have known it from the outside. Right. So it's really that person that's intimately involved, that at least is with that person on a, if not daily, then weekly basis, that has known them prior to the accident and then knows them after the accident. That is really oftentimes the best witness in terms of being able to say something has changed about this person, and here's how they were and here's how they are now. We had a case up in Fairfax County, and it was a missed case, a minor impact type case. And so there wasn't much damage to the vehicle, But thank goodness the sister and the husband and the employer all had observed what had occurred to my client. And the other attorney said he would bet his bar license if we got a decent verdict. And I got the pleasure of calling him up after, or actually right after we got the verdict. I said, "You want to give me your bar license?" So.
I have a quick question for you, Anne. All the talk about the brain being mush and being encased in fluid and just got rattling around. I'll probably be sitting here for the next week thinking of everything that has ever happened in my head. Mm-hmm. But there's something I didn't hear you mention. You were talking about traumatic and non-traumatic, which is still traumatic, and you put the things like stroke in the non-traumatic category, and then of course football injuries in the traumatic. How about brain surgery? How does that qualify as a brain injury?
That's a great question, Asher.
Well, that really is a good question, and I'm sure we have a clean answer on that. When someone has to have some sort of craniotomy, which is the technical term for brain surgery, a piece of the skull comes off and you get in there and you muckle around, it's sort of hard to believe that there wouldn't be some sort of change. But, part of that depends on how, and I don't know how to say it, how clean it is. Mm-hmm. If someone is having surgery for a very targeted tumor, for example, surgeons are very skilled at going in there and messing up as little as possible. I think we've all seen shows where someone is operated on while they're sort of still awake.
Right. So
doctors can go in there and do these sorts of things. I think for those individuals, the likelihood of long-term impacts are probably minimal.
Okay. So everything goes right.
Right.
Then no.
That's what I would like to think.
Marginal.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay.
But the fact that they have to go in to begin with, there's some injury they're trying to fix.
There's something.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
which would be fall into the non-traumatic
Mm-hmm,
category.
Mm-hmm.
You would think by definition of cutting on the brain or going in, or at least cutting the skull and going into the brain, that would be trauma, an external impact. But if they're fixing it as opposed to doing further injury, then perhaps that's not traumatic, but it's very mushy, kind of like the brain itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when you think about it, the brain, when you fall or when you're in a car accident, your brain jostles around, the whole brain is damaged. When you have a stroke, there's one blood vessel in your brain that creates some problems. If you have an anoxic injury, that affects the whole brain in a different way. If someone is shot, for example, there's a very clean path through the brain, so the damage is somewhat, as we call, localized or focal, much more so than a fall, but the way that brain responds is different than the way someone who has had a heart attack responds to car accident. It's one of the things that is so fascinating about the brain. We're going to understand so much more about black holes and life on other planets before we really understand even consciousness.
Right, and also the diagnostic imaging is still constantly developing. I mean, there are images that will show a brain bleed, et cetera, but the imaging continues to develop and become more sophisticated. So over time, hopefully, we will learn more about the mysteries of the brain and the injuries that occur. Mm-hmm. Thank you for joining us today with Anne McDonell, talking about brain injuries. Anne is the executive director of the Brain Injury Association of Virginia. This is Colleen Quinn of Locke and Quinn. Please join my law partner, Richard Locke, next week when he will be talking about divorce, support, and custody issues, something we want nobody to have to face, but unfortunately many people do. Thank you.
There are many, many questions, but the answer is AM 820, WNTW Chester.
Breaking news this hour from townhall.com. I'm Rich Thomason. They're going house to house, knocking on doors and searching cars. Police and federal agents hunting for a killer in a Tampa, Florida neighborhood after the latest deadly shooting there, the fourth in just over a month. Salem Tampa talk show host Bill Bunkley says Seminole Heights residents are on edge.
It is a neighborhood where people, to even live their lives, they have to walk. It's not like those of us who live in the suburbs can get in our car in our garage and go and come.
Seminole Heights resident Sherry Street saying that she's so upset she's thinking about moving.
They just targeting innocent people and shooting them. Who in their right mind would do such a thing?
The latest victim, a 60-year-old man shot in the back as he was crossing the street around 5 a.m. The gunman in a Northern California shooting rampage was out on bail after allegedly stabbing a neighbor. Police say Kevin Neal shot 14 people, killing 4 in multiple locations, and he tried unsuccessfully to get inside an elementary school.
Our evidence appears that he chose the school as a random target. We have not connected him with any one person in the school. But remember, this guy was on a killing rampage. He was driving up and down the street shooting at passerbys and uninvolved residents.
Bahama County Assistant Sheriff Phil Johnson says Neal was shot and killed in a gunfight with police. President Trump, back home after his Asia tour, finds himself having to deal with a firestorm over sexual misconduct allegations against GOP Senate candidate Roy Moore. Moore says he's innocent, will not quit the race. Retail sales rose again last month, an encouraging sign for retailers as the holiday shopping season approaches. On Wall Street, the Dow down 161 points, NASDAQ off 58. More on these stories, townhall.com.
I'm Nick Soboleski, a Select Quote agent with a true story that could save you hundreds of dollars a year. A woman named Linda just called. Her husband, Ray, has a $300,000 group life insurance policy, but is changing jobs and can't take it with him. Well, I shopped the many highly rated term life insurance companies we represent and found Ray, who is 41 and takes medication to control his cholesterol, a 10-year, $500,000 policy for under $27 a month. That's almost twice the coverage for less than half of what he had paid. If SelectQuote hasn't shopped for your life insurance, you're probably paying too much.
For your free quote, call 800-566-2424. That's 800-566-2424. Or go to SelectQuote.com. Since 1985, we shop, you save.
Get full details on the example policy at SelectQuote.com/commercials. Your price could vary depending on your health, issuing company, and other factors. Not available in all states.
China sending a high-level representative to North Korea just days after Chinese President Xi Jinping hosted President Trump for talks about the North Korea nuclear standoff.
The senior Chinese diplomat Song Tao is going to North Korea in his capacity as a Communist Party special envoy. But this has become the diplomatic norm between these two countries. China backed the latest United Nations sanctions, which restrict oil imports. Pyongyang recently warned its historic ally to ponder the grave consequences of chopping down their relations. In a direct jibe at China, President Trump called for a complete end to support for North Korea during his Asia trip.
That's BBC's Robin Brandt. Flash floods on the Greek capital's western outskirts, turning roads into raging rivers of mud and debris, killing at least 2 people and swamping homes and businesses. Breaking news and analysis at townhall.com. Alaska Airlines to end flights to Havana, citing new Trump administration restrictions on travel to Cuba.
The airline says its last flight between Los Angeles and the Cuban capital is planned for January 22nd. Last week, the administration put into effect rules that ended so-called people-to-people travel, which had let individual Americans visit Cuba without going through a sponsoring group or university. Alaska says 80% of its passengers on Cuba flights use the people-to-people allowance. It says that because of the change, it will move planes from Cuba to routes with strong demand and rebook affected customers on another airline or refund their money. The Seattle-based airline began flying to Havana in January. Keith Peters reporting.
Zimbabwe now in the hands of the military. Longtime president, 93-year-old Robert Mugabe, is apparently under house arrest. That follows an unprecedented falling out with the military. More on these stories at townhall.com.
Diabetes, high blood pressure, anxiety meds, everyone's on them. If you're a 50-year-old male, maybe a bit beefy, and you may even have type 2 diabetes, $1 million of term insurance may only cost you about $200 a month. Call Term Provider. Speak with Big Lou at 800-590-7516. Big Lou will find a term life policy for you even if you have type 2 diabetes, are overweight, or have high blood pressure. Term providers help thousands of people like you who think they can't afford term life insurance. To buy $1 million of affordable term life for you, all you need to do is call Big Lou at 800-590-7516. Lou will make sure the scales are tipped in your favor. Call 800-590-7516. Big Lou will answer your call and work to fit you into a term life policy that you can afford. Remember, Big Lou's like you. He's on meds, too. Call 800-590-7516. 800-590-7516.
Your healthy radio addiction starts now.
Power to the people!
The Laura Ingraham Show.
I want to make it perfectly clear. The people of Alabama know me. They know my character. They know what I've stood for in the political world for over 40 years. And I can tell you without hesitation, this is absolutely false. I never did what she said I did. I don't even know the woman. I don't know anything about her.
He should step aside. Number one, these allegations are credible. Number two, he should, if he cares about the values and the people he claims to care about, then he should step aside.
You are listening to the Laura Ingraham Show, 855-40-LAURA. The pressure on Roy Moore to step aside, to step down. It's building. There's no doubt about it. The outcome for the GOP in Alabama, I don't see how it's good. I mean, I don't see how you marshal a write-in campaign. The Alabama GOP would have to launch a massive advertising campaign now and urge people to vote for one candidate. And we have a question, as the Secretary of State said yesterday, John Merrill, on the Ingraham angle. He said people don't remember. They have to remember that thousands of absentee ballots have already been cast. They've been voting since October. Now, I don't know how many ballots, but it's beyond just deployed military. It's a lot more people than that. So that's a question. But we can't just focus on one Senate race. We have other big stories out there, including we're going to get to what happened with this testimony of Jeff Sessions yesterday in Congress, and why, or should an independent counsel, a special counsel, I should say, there is no independent counsel statute, be appointed. I threw out this question, and I'm going to throw it out again, just as a matter of gut. It's kind of fun because then we see how accurate our predictions are. Will Roy Moore step aside before this December 13th election? 855-40-LAURA. He says, no, I'm going to fight to the finish. And he spoke, as you heard, he spoke last night and said this is a spiritual battle, and I'm not going to step aside. There's just no way. Not going to do it. Mark in Texas, prediction, Mark. Yes or no, will he step aside?
If he's innocent, he won't step aside. Never give up to slanderous people.
Tommy in Virginia. Tommy, will he step aside, yes or no? Put yourself in his position, too. I guess at this point he probably has nothing to lose. Go ahead.
I don't think he'll step aside because he's a fighter like Mr. Trump. And then, too, I think it's up to the people in Alabama on whether he whether they vote him in or not. And then I was listening to Hannity last night. Hannity says he got 24 hours to get out because something about the yearbook that he signed. But that doesn't prove that he's guilty. I don't, to me, I don't see whether it proves that he's actually guilty or not.
Yeah, well, I think, we have to remember that it's impossible to prove or disprove charges from 30, 40 years ago. There's just no way. You can't do it. So you just have to say, okay, well, this isn't a legal matter. It's a political matter. Do these women seem credible? Now this last woman's, was it stepson, Raymond? Who came forward on a YouTube video?
The stepson of the latest accuser, Roy Moore, came forward, that Becky Nelson.
Can we hear this again? Let's play this. Because
this is Daryl Nelson.
Daryl Nelson. And he's a good old boy. And he does a YouTube video.
Never mean and no harm.
Yeah, let's Let's listen to this.
I found out that my stepmother was one of the ladies that's accusing Judge Moore of an act that supposedly happened when she was a teenager. Mr. Moore, I support you. I don't believe the acts that she claims you've done. I don't believe it. I've known her for a while now, and I truly do not believe that she's being honest about this.
Well, how does he know? By the way, the Washington Examiner has just retweeted an old piece by Byron York, and it was an old column by Byron, Joe Biden's woman-touching habit. And this is from February 17th, 2015, where you actually have Joe Biden with his hands on the shoulders. He loves putting his hands on the shoulders of women.
The shoulders?
Well, and he's whispering.
Oh.
He's whispering in the ear of Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter's wife, Stephanie, at Carter's swearing in. And he was like, looked like he was whispering sweet nothings into her ear, and she did not look comfortable.
Lord, he's always feeling it. Those poor little children, women. Now, there's a new story that I read a little earlier. Breitbart has it. That a Secret Service agent is coming forward and saying the VP's house and particularly photo ops at Christmas time were no-go zones for women because the vice president would get overly familiar with the ladies, engaging in some of the things that have been alleged about Pappy Bush, George H.W. Bush, where women were, you'll recall, accidentally bumped into his wheelchair and his hand accidentally made 1,000 points of contact with their derrieres.
Raymond has renamed the HW initiative as 1,000 points of contact versus, remember his, all right, we got the 1,000 points of light with all the volunteers in the country. It's his hands fall into the laps and onto the tushes of women, apparently. It's just an involuntary reflex.
It's on the arm of the wheelchair, and the women back into him. I'm sure that's what happened.
Yeah, and so they come to him
right
to give a courtesy kiss on the cheek, and when they do that, they knock into his arm on the arm of the wheelchair,
and they get a little more than they expected.
And his arm involuntarily, for some reason, always gets stuck in the back of the wheelchair and then squeezes. Well, does he have an involuntary reflex?
Maybe that's what it. Every time touch,